Hey there. Tonight, we are descending into a different kind of world. Not the bright, weightless freedom of the modern diver, but the crushing, heavy silence of the early deep. You won't find colorful reefs or effortless gliding here. Just a history built on copper, canvas, and the terrifying finite limit of the human lung. It is a story not of exploration, but of labor. A life defined by the taste of stale rubber, the smell of oil, and the quiet grind of surviving inside a machine where the air is always borrowed. If this kind of heavy industrial storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it actually brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's oddly comforting to know who else is drifting off to the slow rhythm of the pump. So, dim the lights. Let the pressure of the day release as the weight of the water takes over. Settle in, and let's begin with the air above. There is a boundary that exists just beneath the surface of every ocean, every lake, every body of water deep enough to swallow a human form. It is not a line you can see. This boundary is written into the architecture of your body itself, into the tissue of your lungs, into the chemistry of your blood, into the physics of the air you breathe. We are creatures of the surface. The moment we descend below it, we enter a world that was never designed for us. This is not poetry. It is biology, physics, the hard mathematics of pressure and gas and tissue. And for centuries, those who ventured below lived in intimate, terrible knowledge of this truth. Let us begin with the most fundamental terror, the air itself. Your lungs are, in essence, a membrane, a vast folded surface about the size of a tennis court if unfolded completely, dedicated to moving oxygen into your blood and carbon dioxide out. This exchange happens in tiny sacs called alveoli, delicate as soap bubbles, wrapped in capillary networks measuring in micrometers. It is elegant, efficient, but finite. At the surface, breathing is effortless. The pressure inside your lungs equals the pressure outside. Everything is balanced. Underwater, that balance disappears. As you descend, the weight of water increases ambient pressure. At 10 meters, pressure has doubled. At 20, tripled. This pressure presses into every air-filled space in your body, your sinuses, your ears, your lungs. To breathe at depth, the air delivered must match the pressure around you. But as pressure increases, so does gas density. At 30 meters, every breath contains 4 times as many molecules as at the surface. 4 times the nitrogen, 4 times the oxygen, 4 times the carbon dioxide. And your lungs must work 4 times as hard to move that denser air. Imagine breathing through a straw that keeps narrowing, the air growing thicker until every inhalation feels like dragging syrup through a sieve. The work of breathing increases exponentially. If you're doing work underwater, walking in a heavy suit, hauling cable, your body demands more oxygen. Your muscles produce more CO2. Your breathing rate climbs. But the denser air resists. Ventilation lags. And slowly, carbon dioxide accumulates in your blood. This is hypercapnia. Quiet suffocation that arrives not because you have no air, but because you cannot move it fast enough. Boyle's law states that gas volume is inversely proportional to pressure. Your lungs obey this absolutely. For a breath-hold diver, Boyle's law is a countdown. At 10 meters, that lungful compresses to half its volume. At 20, 1/3. At 30, 1/4. The air is still there, but it occupies less space, pressed tighter by the water's weight. As volume decreases, so does surface area for gas exchange. But there's something stranger. As lungs compress, blood is displaced from limbs and forced into the chest. Blood shift. The body's attempt to fill the shrinking space where air used to be. It allows freedivers to reach astonishing depths, but the pressure inside pulmonary vessels rises. The capillaries endure stress they were never designed for. At extreme depths, they rupture. Blood leaks into the alveoli. The diver tastes copper, surfaces spitting red foam. This is lung squeeze. Injury caused not by lack of air, but by compression itself. Here is a fact that surprises almost everyone. The urge to breathe, that desperate panic when you hold your breath, is not triggered by lack of oxygen. It's triggered by carbon dioxide buildup. Your body has no reliable sensor for low oxygen. Hypoxia can creep up silently, dimming vision, clouding thought, pulling you toward unconsciousness without alarm. But carbon dioxide, your brainstem monitors it obsessively. When concentration rises past a threshold, it screams at you to breathe. Underwater, this becomes a liability. If ventilation cannot keep pace with CO2 production, the gas builds. But you cannot simply breathe faster. The dense air resists. The feeling is unmistakable. Chest tightness, creeping suffocation, rising panic that tells you you're running out of air when your tanks may still be half full. For early divers, this was insidious. They didn't understand gas density or hypercapnia. They only knew that sometimes the air in their helmets seemed to stop working. They would gasp and labor, feeling as though they were drowning while air hissed past their heads. And sometimes they did not surface in time. When you immerse in water, before you even descend, your body changes. Hydrostatic pressure squeezes blood upward from your legs into your chest. Your heart works harder. Your lungs feel stiffer, as if wrapped in an invisible corset. As you descend, this intensifies. Pulmonary vessels engorge. The delicate balance governing gas exchange is disrupted. Breathing feels wrong. Not impossible, but effortful. For divers doing heavy work, men in canvas suits, weighted with lead, this became the limiting factor. Not strength, not endurance, but their ability to breathe. There is a final, quieter truth about breathing compressed air at depth. It leaves marks. Over hundreds of dives, lungs begin to change. Repeated pressure exposure causes tissue remodeling, scarring, stiffening, reduced elasticity. Lungs become less efficient, aging faster than they should. Commercial divers often developed chronic respiratory issues in later years. Shortness of breath, reduced tolerance, lungs quietly damaged by years at the edge of biological limits. Not dramatic, no catastrophic event, just the slow, cumulative cost of asking the body to do something it was never meant to do. Imagine being among the first to descend in a diving suit. Sealed in canvas, brass helmet screwed tight, air hissing from above, controlled by men you cannot see. You don't understand why it sometimes feels thick and useless, why your chest aches, why panic rises even though the line is connected. You only know you're walking where no human should be, and the boundary between life and death is thin as the rubber gasket sealing your helmet. Early divers lived with terror we can barely imagine. No understanding of gas density, hypercapnia, pulmonary mechanics. Only their bodies telling them, you do not belong here. And yet they went. Into crushing depths, into darkness and cold. Walking the ocean floor in heavy suits, doing impossible work. They felt it in every labored breath, every tight chest expansion, in the knowledge that the surface was far away and the way back was not guaranteed. They were biological ambassadors in a hostile realm, and their lungs reminded them with every single breath. The air above, the surface, where breathing is easy and thoughtless and free. For those who descend, it is impossibly far away. But humans refuse to accept the boundary. If we couldn't breathe underwater, we would bring air with us. The diving bell was one of the oldest solutions. Invert a container, submerge it, and trapped air remains, held by buoyancy against the water pressing from below. But the air didn't last. In 1690, Edmund Halley turned his attention to this problem. He designed weighted barrels filled with surface air, lowered to the bell, where fresh air would rise into the chamber, displacing stale CO2-laden air. It worked, not perfectly, but it extended dive duration from minutes to hours. Meaningful work became possible. Later, bells added hoses from the surface, allowing longer dives still. Though the deeper you went, the more pressure required to force air down. But even with fresh air, the bell's environment was brutal. A cramped iron chamber, barely large enough for 2 or 3 men. Water lapping below. Air hissing in, damp and metallic. Condensation formed constantly. Cold water chilled metal walls. Warm exhalations beaded and dripped back down. Everything wet, everything cold. The air felt wrong. Pressure inside matched water pressure, so the men breathed compressed air, denser than anything on land. It made their voices sound strange, higher, flatter. Carbon dioxide still accumulated. The air grew thick, stale, headaches, dizziness, the sense they couldn't quite catch their breath. Metabolic heat trapped in confined space. Humidity approaching 100%. The sensation of suffocation, even with air hissing around them. It wasn't pleasant, but it was better than drowning. Halley's bell proved a concept. Humans could survive and work underwater for extended periods if they solved the air supply problem. The heavy suit would come later, the helmet, canvas and rubber and brass. But the essential logic, the umbilical cord connecting diver to surface, was already there. And the divers inside those bells learned what their descendants would learn a century later. The air you breathe is not a given. It is delivered through ingenuity and engineering and the labor of others. And even with fresh air flowing, your lungs are still constrained by the same biological limits. The water does not care about your inventions. The pressure does not negotiate. You are still and always a creature of the surface, just visiting. Fire and water are ancient enemies. One consumes, the other drowns. One rises, the other falls. For most of human history, they occupied separate realms of danger, each demanding its own respect, its own caution. But in the early 19th century, in the soot-stained heart of industrial Britain, these two elemental forces would collide in an unexpected way. And from that collision would emerge the technology that would allow humans to walk, for the first time, on the floor of the ocean. It began with smoke, and a man trying to save lives from fire. In 1823, a man named Charles Dean secured a patent for an unusual piece of equipment. He called it a smoke helmet. Britain, at that time, was burning, not literally, though fires were common enough, but burning with industry. Factories, foundries, shipyards. Coal smoke hung perpetually over London, turning the air grey and the buildings black. And with all that industry came fire. Devastating, deadly fires that tore through wooden structures, through warehouses stuffed with flammable goods, through the narrow streets of cities not yet designed for such concentrated heat and chaos. Firefighting was primitive. dangerous, often fatal. Men would rush into smoke-filled rooms with nothing but wet cloths over their mouths, hoping to drag out victims or douse flames before their lungs gave out. Many never emerged. Charles Dean believed he could solve this problem. His invention was straightforward in concept: a sealed copper helmet, heavy and bell-shaped, that fit over a man's head and rested on his shoulders. Attached to this helmet was a canvas garment that covered the torso. And running into the helmet through a watertight fitting was a hose, fed by bellows operated by men outside the burning building. Fresh air would be pumped in continuously, flowing around the wearer's head and escaping at the bottom of the garment, creating positive pressure that would keep smoke out. It was ingenious. It should have worked. But it was also awkward. The helmet weighed perhaps 30 pounds of solid copper. The hose was stiff and cumbersome. The whole apparatus was expensive to manufacture, difficult to maintain, and required a dedicated team to operate the bellows. Fire brigades, already stretched thin and operating on limited budgets, looked at Dean's smoke helmet and saw a solution to a problem they had learned to live with. The technology was impressive, certainly, but it was not practical. Not at that price. Not with that level of complexity. They did not adopt it. The smoke helmet, for all its promise, failed commercially. Charles Dean and his brother John found themselves with an expensive, patented piece of equipment that no one wanted to buy. The brothers needed a new application, a new market, a reason for their invention to exist. They would find it at the bottom of the sea. There is a story, possibly apocryphal, possibly true, about how John Dean first thought to use the smoke helmet underwater. He was present, the story goes, at the scene of a stable fire. Horses trapped inside screaming, the smoke too thick for anyone to enter. John Dean, either thinking quickly or acting on desperate impulse, improvised a primitive breathing hood from whatever materials were at hand and went inside. He saved the horses. Whether this story is literally true matters less than what it represents. The moment when someone realized that the problem of breathing in smoke and the problem of breathing underwater were, in a fundamental sense, the same problem. In both cases, you needed to bring clean air with you into an environment that would otherwise suffocate you. In both cases, you needed a sealed chamber around your head, a hose supplying fresh air, and a mechanism to keep the hostile atmosphere out. Fire gives birth to the diving suit, not through careful planning or incremental development, but through failure and improvisation, and the desperate need to find a use for something that had already been built. By the late 1820s, the Dean brothers were conducting experiments in the Thames. Murky, cold, sluggish with sewage and industrial runoff. The Thames was not a kind testing ground, but it was available, and it was deep enough. They modified the smoke helmet for underwater use. The principle remained the same. Copper helmet, canvas garment, air pumped from the surface through a hose. But the execution had to change. Water was denser than smoke, more aggressive, more eager to find any gap or weakness in the seal. They tested at Whitstable, at Gosport, anywhere there were wrecks or salvage opportunities, or simply enough depth to prove the concept. And slowly, incrementally, the apparatus began to work. The helmet was converted into what would later be called an open diving helmet. It sat on the diver's shoulders, heavy enough that its own weight kept it in place. Air flowed in from the hose, filled the space inside the helmet, and escaped at the bottom, at the neck opening, creating a pocket of breathable atmosphere held in place by continuous positive pressure. It was not elegant, but it was functional. the Dean brothers began partnering with salvage crews, professional wreckers who made their living recovering cargo from ships that had foundered on rocks, run aground in storms, or simply rotted and sunk in harbor. And the helmet proved its worth. Salvage diving in the early 19th century was a brutal and lucrative business. Ships carried valuable cargo: copper ingots, timber, machinery, textiles, spirits. When a ship went down in shallow water, and many did, along Britain's treacherous coastline, that cargo did not simply vanish. It sat on the bottom waiting. Whoever could retrieve it stood to make a fortune. But retrieval required getting down to the wreck and staying down long enough to work. Breath-hold divers could make brief trips, grabbing what they could reach in 30 seconds or a minute before their lungs screamed for air. But a wreck did not give up its treasures easily. Cargo was often trapped beneath timbers, buried in silt, tangled in rigging. The Dean brothers' helmet changed the equation. A diver wearing the apparatus could stay down for an hour or more, breathing continuously, working methodically, clearing debris, and hauling up load after load of recovered goods. The air was thick and the helmet was heavy, and the constant flow of bubbles from the neck opening made a roaring, hissing noise that drowned out all other sound. But it worked. Early successes included major recoveries of copper from sunken vessels, copper being dense, valuable, and easy to identify even under layers of marine growth. Each successful salvage brought attention, brought contracts, brought interest from other commercial operations, and eventually from the Royal Navy. The apparatus that had failed as firefighting equipment was succeeding spectacularly as diving equipment. The market had been found. The future was clear. Not fire, water, but the open helmet carried within it a design flaw so fundamental, so dangerous, that it would shape every diving helmet that came after. The helmet sat on the shoulders. It was not sealed to the suit. It did not lock into place with bolts or clamps or any kind of permanent attachment. It simply rested there, held by its own weight and by the diver's posture. Air flowed in from the top, through the hose, and escaped at the bottom, at the neck opening, creating a continuous cascade of bubbles. This outward flow kept water from entering. As long as the pressure inside the helmet remained higher than the water pressure at the neck opening, the boundary held. But that boundary depended entirely on the diver remaining upright. If you tripped, if you stumbled, if you bent too far forward or were knocked over by a current, the geometry changed. The opening at the bottom of the helmet tilted, the air rushed out, and water poured in from below. A single misstep could flood the helmet completely, instantly. Imagine it. You are walking across the wreckage of a ship, 20 meters down, visibility near zero, moving carefully over broken timbers and corroded metal. Your helmet is full of air, hissing and roaring with the constant flow. You are breathing, you are working, and then your foot catches on a snarl of rope. You pitch forward. The angle shifts. Cold seawater floods into the helmet, pouring over your face, filling your nose and mouth. You gasp reflexively and inhale water. The weight of the flooded helmet drives you further down. The air is gone. You are drowning in a pocket that was, 1 second ago, full of breathable air. And there is no way to recover, no way to purge the water, no way to tilt the helmet back upright while it is full of 30 pounds of seawater. The only option is to rip the helmet off your head entirely, which requires you to somehow release the straps or fastenings while panicking, while drowning, while the weight of the suit and the helmet and the water itself conspires to hold you down. Many divers did not make it. Early divers in open helmets learned to move with excruciating caution. Each step was deliberate, each motion carefully controlled. You could not bend at the waist to pick something up, not safely. You could not lean forward to inspect a crevice or reach under a beam. You moved slowly, methodically, keeping your spine as vertical as possible, as if balancing a cup of water on your head that you could not afford to spill. Because you couldn't. The wreckage did not make this easy. Ships broke apart in violent, chaotic ways. Timbers jutted at odd angles. Metal plates curled and twisted. Rope and cable and netting lay everywhere, ready to snag a foot, trip an ankle, pull you off balance. And the current, always the current, pushing, pulling, swirling unpredictably around the wreck. A sudden surge could knock you sideways, tilt you just enough for the water to find the gap. There were other ways to die too. If the air hose kinked, if the pump on the surface failed, if the flow of air slowed or stopped for any reason, the pressure inside the helmet would drop. The water pressure would equalize, and the air bubble that was keeping you alive would collapse, allowing water to rush in even if you were standing perfectly upright. It was a system held together by continuous vigilance, by perfect posture, by the constant flow of air and the constant attention of the pump operators on the surface. One failure anywhere in the chain, and the diver drowned. The open bottom flooding hazard became in time the defining design problem of early diving technology. Every improvement, every innovation, every new patent that followed was, in one way or another, an attempt to solve this problem, to eliminate the fatal vulnerability of the open helmet, to create a system where a diver could bend, could move, could fall and recover without flooding. The solution, when it came, would be obvious in retrospect. Seal the helmet to the suit, attach them permanently, eliminate the gap. But that solution required new materials, new manufacturing techniques, new understanding of pressure equalization and airflow. It would take years to develop, and in the meantime, men worked and died in open helmets, moving carefully, always aware that the line between breathing and drowning was as thin as the angle of their spine. The apparatus that had been born from fire, that had pivoted from failure to success, now carried within it a new lesson: that innovation solves problems, but also creates them, that every solution is temporary, that the water is patient and unforgiving, and always searching for a way in. There are moments in history when disaster and innovation collide, when a tragedy becomes, against all intention, a catalyst for technological advancement. The sinking of HMS Royal George was one such moment. It was not supposed to happen. The ship was not at war. It was not caught in a storm. It was anchored peacefully at Spithead, in calm water, on a routine maintenance day in August of 1782. And yet, in the span of minutes, it took between 800 and 1,200 souls to the bottom with it. The Royal George would become many things in death: a mass grave, a navigational hazard, a political embarrassment, and eventually, inevitably, a proving ground, the place where the technology of diving would be tested, refined, and ultimately perfected into the form that would define underwater work for the next century. But first, it had to sink. HMS Royal George was a first-rate ship of the line, 100 guns, a floating fortress of oak and iron, the pride of the Royal Navy. On that August day in 1782, she lay at anchor while workers attended to some routine repairs below the waterline, a common enough procedure called heeling. To heel a ship is to tip it deliberately to one side, raising the opposite side's hull out of the water so that carpenters can reach sections that would normally be submerged. It is a delicate operation, requiring careful calculation of weight distribution, ballast, and angle. The method used that day was called a parliamentary heel, named, some say, because it was done in a hurried, half-considered way, much like legislation passed in haste. Instead of properly shifting ballast or using external flotation, the crew simply ran the ship's guns to one side, using their immense weight to tip the vessel. It should have been a small heel, a manageable angle, just enough to expose the hull for repairs. But someone miscalculated, or the guns were shifted too far, or the ship, after years of service, was not as stable as it once had been. The angle increased, and kept increasing. The lower gun ports on the heel side, which should have been well above the waterline, dipped toward the surface, and then below it. Water began pouring in through the open gun ports. What happened next took perhaps 8 minutes from start to finish. The water rushing through the gun ports flooded the lower gun decks almost instantly. The weight of that water pulled the ship further over. More gun ports went under. More water poured in. The process accelerated, became unstoppable, a cascading failure where each second of flooding made the next second worse. Men scrambled, shouted, tried to close the gun ports, but they opened inward. The design intended to protect them from enemy fire now made them impossible to seal against the inrushing sea. Tried to run the guns back to the other side, but the deck was already tilting too steeply, the tons of iron and wood impossible to move uphill against gravity and chaos. The Royal George rolled, not violently, but with a terrible, inexorable grace. She settled onto her side and then continued rolling, the masts dipping toward the water, the hull rotating past the point of no return. And then she went down, not capsized and floating belly up, but settling almost upright onto the seabed, 65 feet below the surface. Straight down, taking with her nearly 1,000 people who had no time to escape, no chance to swim clear, no warning that the world was about to turn sideways and swallow them whole. Sailors, officers, workmen, civilian vendors who had been selling goods from small boats alongside, women and children visiting the crew, all of them gone in less time than it takes to boil water. The disaster was complete, sudden, and absolutely preventable. Spithead, where the Royal George sank, was and remains one of the busiest maritime corridors in Britain. The protected waters between Portsmouth and the Isle of Wight served as an assembly point for naval fleets, a staging ground for expeditions, a highway for merchant traffic. And now, sitting in the middle of that highway, was the corpse of a 100-gun ship, 65 feet down, still largely intact, masts jutting upward like the ribs of some great drowned beast, a hazard to navigation, a threat to any vessel with a deep draft that might clip the wreckage in poor visibility or heavy seas, and practically speaking, a treasure trove. The Royal George carried guns, bronze and iron cannon worth a fortune in scrap or reuse. She carried copper in her sheathing, her fittings, her stores. She carried supplies, tools, personal effects, anything and everything that had been aboard a fully provisioned warship when she went down. Salvage rights were valuable, but so was the need to clear the channel. The wreck could not simply be left there. It had to be dealt with. For decades it wasn't. Early salvage attempts in the late 18th and early 19th centuries recovered some guns, some copper, some debris. Divers working in primitive equipment, or using grappling hooks and dredges from the surface, managed to strip a few valuable items from the upper portions of the wreck. But the bulk of it remained, the hull settling deeper into the silt. The scattered debris, spreading outward with every storm and tide. By the 1830s, the Royal George was still there, still a problem, still waiting. In 1839, the British government decided to finally, definitively, deal with the wreck. They assigned the task to Colonel Charles William Pasley, a military engineer with a reputation for solving impossible problems. Pasley approached the Royal George like a military campaign, or perhaps more accurately, like a siege. He assembled a team, secured funding, brought in the best divers available, and set about systematically dismantling the wreck using every tool at his disposal: engineering, organization, and, crucially, explosives. This was not a salvage operation in the traditional sense. This was demolition, clearance. The goal was not to raise the Royal George intact, but to reduce it to rubble small enough that it would no longer threaten shipping. Any valuable materials recovered in the process were a bonus, not the objective. Pasley's operation would span years, seasons, hundreds of dives. It became, in effect, the Manhattan Project of underwater salvage, an enormous, expensive, high-profile effort that pushed the boundaries of what was technically possible. And it became a proving ground for diving technology. The conditions at the Royal George site were punishing. Spithead is subject to strong tidal currents that sweep through twice daily. Visibility in the water is often poor, reduced to a few feet by suspended silt and plankton. The wreck itself was unstable, broken, dangerous. A twisted maze of timbers and metal, sharp edges and entanglement hazards, collapsing compartments and pockets of trapped air that could shift and release without warning. Divers working on the site faced all of these challenges while wearing the best equipment available at the time, which, in the early years of Pasley's operation, meant open helmets, the Dean brothers' design, the same apparatus that had succeeded in shallower, calmer salvage work. But here, in the strong currents and complex geometry of the wreck, its limitations became brutally apparent. Divers were knocked off balance by the tide. They had to maneuver through tight spaces, bend, reach, twist their bodies to place explosives or attach rigging. And every movement carried the risk that the helmet would tilt, that water would flood in, that the diver would drown in the hissing bubble of air that had, a moment before, been keeping them alive. Accidents happened. Men died. Not in great numbers. Pasley ran a careful operation with trained personnel and safety protocols, but enough. Enough to make it clear that the technology was not adequate to the task. The Royal George was teaching lessons. Expensive, sometimes fatal lessons. And among those paying attention was a German-born engineer working in London, a man named Augustus Sieber. Augustus Sieber was not a diver. He was a maker of things. A mechanical engineer with a workshop in Southwark, specializing in precision equipment, pumps, engines, scientific instruments. But he understood pressure. He understood seals. And he understood that the diving equipment being used at the Royal George was fundamentally flawed. Sieber had been aware of the Dean brothers' work, had perhaps even collaborated with them or examined their equipment. But watching the Royal George operation unfold, seeing the reports of near misses and fatalities, he recognized the core problem. The helmet and the suit were not connected. As long as there was a gap at the neck, as long as the seal depended on posture and air pressure and the diver's ability to remain upright, the system would remain dangerous, unreliable, unsuitable for the kind of heavy, complex work that salvage operations demanded. The solution, Sieber understood, was not to improve the open helmet. It was to eliminate the opening entirely. In 1837, Augustus Sieber, introduced what would come to be known as the standard diving dress. The design was revolutionary in its simplicity. The helmet was no longer a separate piece that sat on the shoulders. Instead, it was bolted, physically bolted, with a threaded metal collar, to a watertight canvas suit that covered the entire body. The suit was rubberized, sealed at the wrists and ankles. The diver climbed in through an opening in the chest, which was then closed and secured. Once dressed, the diver was encased in a waterproof envelope, head to toe. Air was pumped in from the surface through a hose, just as before. But now, instead of escaping freely at the neck, it filled the entire suit. The diver breathed the air, and the exhaled breath, along with the excess air being pumped in, was vented through a valve mounted on the helmet. This valve was key. It was spring-loaded, adjustable, designed to maintain a slight positive pressure inside the suit. Enough to keep water out, enough to keep the suit inflated and the diver mobile. But not so much that the diver ballooned uncontrollably or lost the ability to descend. The result was a sealed system. The diver was no longer dependent on posture to maintain the air bubble. They could bend, kneel, fall over, and stand back up. The helmet would not flood. The suit would not compress. They were, for the first time, truly free to work underwater. Seeb's closed dress was put to the test at the Royal George site, and it performed beautifully. Divers could now place explosive charges in confined spaces, reaching under timbers and into crevices that had previously been inaccessible. They could work through the strong tidal currents without constant fear of being knocked off balance. They could spend longer periods on the bottom, doing more productive work per dive, because they were not exhausted by the constant vigilance required to keep the helmet upright. The difference was night and day. Pasley's operation accelerated. Guns were recovered, dozens of them, massive bronze cannon lifted from the silt and hauled to the surface. Copper sheathing was stripped from the hull. Timber was cut away, and explosive charges, carefully placed by divers in closed dress, systematically broke the wreck into manageable pieces. By the mid-1840s, the Royal George was no longer a navigational hazard. The wreck had been reduced to scattered debris, low-profile remnants that ships could safely pass over. The operation was declared a success, and the technology that had made it possible, Seeb's standard diving dress, became the template for all heavy diving that would follow. The design was so successful, so reliable, so fundamentally sound, that it remained essentially unchanged for more than a century. The standard diving dress, or heavy suit, became the definitive form of the technology. Copper helmet, rubberized canvas suit, lead weights to counteract buoyancy, boots weighted with more lead, the whole apparatus weighing well over 100 pounds out of water, but neutral or slightly negative once submerged. Exhaust valves were refined, air pumps improved, helmets were fitted with better viewports, communication systems, emergency releases. But the core concept, the sealed suit, the bolted helmet, the continuous air supply from the surface remained. It was cumbersome. It was expensive. It required a support team topside to manage the air supply and the diver's safety. But it worked, and it worked reliably, in conditions where the open helmet had failed. The Royal George had demanded a solution. The wreck, with its strong currents and complex geometry and years of grinding, dangerous work, had forced the technology to evolve. And in evolving, it had arrived at a form that would define underwater work for generations. Salvage as a forcing function, disaster as a catalyst. The dead of the Royal George, resting somewhere in the silt of Spithead, had become, in an unintended and deeply ironic way, midwives to the birth of the heavy suit. The suit was born from tragedy, refined by necessity, and tested in the cold water above the remains of 800 souls who never asked to serve this purpose. But serve it they did, and the technology that emerged from their grave would carry humans deeper and further, and into stranger places than anyone in 1782 could possibly have imagined. There comes a depth where walking is no longer possible, where the pressure becomes so great that the concept of a human being standing upright on the seafloor becomes absurd, where the standard diving dress, for all its ingenious seals and weighted boots and copper magnificence, simply cannot function. For the heavy suit divers of the 19th and early 20th centuries, this depth was around 300 feet. Some went deeper, but 300 feet was, practically speaking, the wall. Beyond that, the work of breathing became too great. The risk of nitrogen narcosis, of oxygen toxicity, of decompression sickness became too severe. And yet the ocean continued downward, miles downward, into zones where no light penetrated, where the pressure would crush a human body like a paper cup. To go deeper required a different approach entirely, not walking, but falling, not a suit, but a vessel, not a diver breathing compressed air, but an observer sealed inside a protective shell, lowered on a cable into the abyss. The bathysphere was that shell, and the man who conceived of it was not a diver, not an engineer, but a naturalist obsessed with seeing what lived in the places humans could never reach. His name was William Beebe. William Beebe was a biologist, a writer, a curator at the New York Zoological Society. By the 1920s, his attention had turned to the deep ocean, the vast, dark, unexplored volume of water that made up the majority of the planet's biosphere, and yet remained almost entirely unknown. Scientists of the time understood the deep sea only through what they could dredge up. Nets would return strange, mangled creatures, fish with enormous eyes, shrimp with bioluminescent organs, jellies so fragile they disintegrated on contact with air. But these specimens were dead, distorted by the pressure change. Their behavior, their ecology, their true appearance in life, all remained a mystery. Beebe wanted to see them alive, in their habitat, undisturbed. He experimented with diving helmets, pushing to 300 feet, breathing the thick narcotic air, feeling the pressure squeeze his chest. And he understood that this was as far as a human could go in a suit. The physiology would not permit it. To go deeper, something fundamentally different was required. He needed not to breathe the water's pressure, but to resist it. Not a flexible suit, but a rigid shell. Enter Otis Barton, a wealthy engineer, a tinkerer, a man with both the technical knowledge and the financial means to make improbable ideas real. Barton approached Beebe with a proposal, a steel sphere, thick-walled and perfectly round, designed to distribute pressure evenly across its surface. No weak points, no corners or seams where stress could concentrate. Just a continuous, unbroken shell that would, theoretically, remain intact at any depth where the steel itself did not fail. The geometry was crucial. A cylinder or a box would have pressure points where force would concentrate and eventually breach the hull. But a sphere distributes load perfectly. Every point on the surface bears an equal share. The deeper you go, the more the sphere tries to compress uniformly inward, rather than buckling or rupturing at a weak spot. This was the answer, not by fighting the pressure with pumps and equalization, but by accepting it, by building a shell strong enough that the pressure, immense as it was, simply did not matter. They named it the bathysphere, from the Greek bathes, meaning deep, and sphaira, meaning sphere. The bathysphere was not large, 4 feet 9 inches in interior diameter, barely enough room for 2 men to sit, cramped and hunched, knees drawn up, shoulders touching. The walls were cast steel, 1.5 inches thick. 5,000 pounds of metal forged into a hollow ball with an interior volume smaller than a telephone booth. The casting had to be perfect. No voids, no inclusions, no weak points that might fail under stress. 3 small windows were set into the hull. Not glass, glass would shatter, but fused quartz, 3 inches thick, ground and polished to optical clarity. Each window was cone-shaped, wider on the outside than the inside, so that water pressure would wedge the quartz more tightly into its seat. The windows were the weakest points, but Barton calculated they would hold to at least 3,000 feet. A single circular hatch, 14 inches in diameter, provided entry and exit, just large enough for a man to squeeze through if he twisted his body at awkward angles. The hatch was a steel plug, with 10 bolts around the perimeter to seal it tight. Once those bolts were fastened from the outside, the occupants were entombed. There was no way to open the hatch from inside. No escape. You went down, or you stayed down. Inside the bathysphere, there was no air hose, no umbilical feeding fresh oxygen from the surface. That was impossible. No hose could withstand the pressure at the depths they intended to reach. Instead, the sphere carried its own atmosphere. Tanks of compressed oxygen were mounted inside, with valves to replenish the air as it was consumed. To absorb carbon dioxide, the bathysphere used trays of soda lime, a chemical compound that reacts with CO2 and binds it into a solid form. It worked. As long as the occupants remained calm, breathed shallowly, and did not exert themselves, the oxygen and soda lime could sustain them for several hours. But the air inside grew stale, humid, warm from body heat and the chemical reaction. Condensation formed on the cold steel walls, pooling on the floor. The smell of wet metal, of human breath, of the faintly acrid scrubber chemicals. It all combined into an oppressive, claustrophobic atmosphere. And if something went wrong, if the oxygen failed, if the scrubber became saturated, there was no quick ascent. The bathysphere could only be raised as fast as the winch could pull it. Minutes that would feel like hours, while the air grew thin and the carbon dioxide built up. Communication with the surface was maintained through a single electrical cable spliced into the main steel cable that held the sphere. It carried a telephone connection. Voice, crackling and distorted, but functional. BB used this line to narrate what he saw, to describe in real time the creatures passing by the windows, the color of the water, the sensations of the descent. A stenographer on the surface would transcribe his words. It was the only link, the only reassurance that the sphere had not been severed from the world above. As long as BB's voice crackled through the speaker, the surface crew knew the men inside were alive. If the telephone went silent, they would have to assume the worst. Between 1930 and 1934, BB and Barton conducted a series of dives off the coast of Bermuda. Each dive pushed deeper than the last, testing the sphere, testing the cable, testing the limits of what the human mind could endure. The descent was slow, controlled. The winch operator had to manage the cable carefully, lowering the sphere at a steady rate. Too fast, and the cable might snap from shock loading. Too slow, and the men inside would consume their air before reaching any significant depth. At first, the light remained. Brilliant, shimmering blue-green, the sunlight filtering down through clear tropical water. Then the colors began to disappear. Red went first. By 50 feet, everything red appeared black. The wavelength of red light was absorbed most quickly by the water. Orange followed, then yellow. By 200 feet, the world was a monochrome of blue and green, drained of warmth. Green faded next. By 500 feet, only blue remained. A deep, cold, penetrating blue. The purest blue BB had ever seen. And then, around 600 feet, even the blue began to fail, fading to grey, to charcoal, to darkness so complete that BB could no longer see his hand in front of his face. This was the bathypelagic zone, the midnight zone, a realm of perpetual darkness where sunlight simply could not reach. And yet, it was not entirely dark. The first time BB saw bioluminescence in the deep, he struggled to find words. Living sparks was the phrase he settled on. Flashes of cold light, green and blue and sometimes white, appearing and vanishing in the darkness outside the quartz windows. Some were brief, single pulses. Others lingered, glowing steadily, drifting past like embers on a night wind. He saw fish with rows of photophores along their sides, lighting up in sequence like runway lights. Shrimp trailing luminous clouds. Jellies pulsing with rhythmic bioluminescent waves. Creatures he could not identify. Shapes glimpsed only by their own light, too strange or too fast to fully comprehend. The deep ocean was not dark. Not to the creatures that lived there. It was full of light. Their light, produced chemically in specialized organs, used for hunting, for mating, for communication, for defense. BB described tentacles glowing blue, a dragonfish, black and serpentine, with fangs and a glowing lure. A hatchet fish, its belly lined with lights that matched the faint glow from above, rendering it invisible to predators looking up from below. These were not specimens in jars. These were living animals, behaving naturally, undisturbed by the sphere. They swam past the windows, mere inches from BB's face, the first of their kind ever seen by human eyes. On August 15, 1934, BB and Barton descended to 3,028 feet. At that depth, the pressure outside the sphere was over 1,360 pounds per square inch, 93 times atmospheric pressure, enough to compress the steel hull inward by a measurable amount, enough to make the quartz windows flex and creak. But the sphere held. BB looked out through the quartz and saw darkness, and within that darkness, the living sparks. Animals that had never been seen, never been named, barely even suspected to exist. He spoke into the telephone, his voice strained from the thin air and the tension. The stenographer on the surface transcribed his words, and slowly the winch began to reverse, dragging the sphere back toward the light. They had done it. They had reached deeper than any human had ever gone and returned to tell the story. The bathysphere had proven that humans could observe the deep, not as workers, not as divers walking on the bottom, but as witnesses, passengers, observers lowered into the abyss and pulled back out, carrying with them the first direct accounts of life in the deepest, darkest, strangest parts of the ocean. But there was a cost, a risk that shadowed every dive. The bathysphere hung from a single steel cable, 7/8 of an inch in diameter, woven from multiple strands, rated to hold far more than the sphere's weight, but not accounting for corrosion, for metal fatigue, for the torsion and flexing that occurred as the sphere was lowered and raised through currents and swells. If the cable snapped, there was no backup, no secondary line. The sphere would fall, tumbling through the darkness, accelerating until it hit the bottom. And even if it reached the bottom intact, there was no way out. No ballast to drop, no mechanism to make the sphere buoyant. The men inside would consume their oxygen and eventually suffocate in the dark, sealed in their steel tomb. Early tests had revealed dangerous twisting in the cable. The sphere, hanging freely, wanted to rotate, introducing torsion that could weaken the strands over time. Inside the sphere, Beebe and Barton could hear the cable. Every creak, every groan, transmitted through the steel and amplified in the enclosed space. They could hear the winch, faintly, a distant mechanical rhythm. And they knew every moment of every dive that their lives depended on that single strand of woven steel. That if it failed, no one could save them. The ocean would keep them. The bathysphere was a triumph, a leap forward in exploration, in observation, in humanity's understanding of the deep ocean. It proved that the abyss was not empty, that life existed in the darkness, strange and beautiful and entirely adapted to its alien environment. But it was also a reminder of just how fragile the connection between surface and depth truly was. How much humans depended on technology, on cables and seals and steel, to survive even briefly in that crushing, lightless realm. The heavy suit had allowed humans to walk on the bottom, to work with their hands, to stand upright and labor in the shallows. But beyond a certain depth, walking was impossible. The only option was to fall, to descend, passive and enclosed, and hope that the cable held long enough to bring you back. It was a different kind of diving, a different kind of courage, not the slow, mechanical bravery of the helmet diver, but the quiet, patient terror of the observer, watching the darkness through quartz windows, breathing stale air, listening to the steel creak, and trusting, hoping that today would not be the day the cable snapped. There is a moment in the history of any technology when it stops being a tool for survival and becomes something else, something closer to art, to exploration for its own sake, to the pure joy of doing something that was previously impossible. For underwater diving, that moment came in 1943 on the coast of occupied France, when a naval officer and an engineer solved a problem that had constrained divers for centuries. The problem was simple. How do you breathe underwater without being tethered to the surface? The heavy suit required an air hose. The bathysphere required a cable. Every system that had ever allowed humans to survive below the surface had depended on a physical connection, an umbilical, linking them to the world above. It fed them air. It pulled them back. It defined the limits of where they could go and how long they could stay. But what if you could carry the air with you? What if you could be free? Jacques-Yves Cousteau and Émile Gagnon gave the world that freedom. And in doing so, they transformed diving from an industrial act into something that felt, for the first time, almost natural. The challenge was not simply carrying compressed air in tanks. That technology already existed. Firefighters used it. Rescue workers used it. The problem was delivering that air to the diver in a way that matched the pressure of the surrounding water at any depth. At the surface, you breathe air at 1 atmosphere of pressure, about 14.7 pounds per square inch. At 10 meters underwater, the pressure is 2 atmospheres. At 20 meters, 3 atmospheres. The air you breathe must match that pressure. or your lungs cannot expand, your chest cannot draw breath. Earlier attempts at self-contained diving apparatus had used constant flow systems, air released continuously from the tank, regardless of whether the diver was inhaling or not. It worked after a fashion, but it was wasteful, inefficient. The tanks would empty in minutes, and much of the air was simply lost, bubbling away unused. What was needed was a system that delivered air only when the diver wanted to breathe, a system that responded to demand. Émile Gagnon, an engineer working for a Parisian gas company, had been developing automatic valves for regulating gas flow in automobiles, a wartime adaptation necessitated by fuel shortages. Jacques-Yves Cousteau, a French naval officer with a passion for underwater filming and exploration, approached Gagnon with the diving problem. Together, they adapted Gagnon's valve design into the first truly practical demand regulator. The principle was elegant. The regulator sat between the high-pressure air tank and the diver's mouthpiece. When the diver inhaled, the slight negative pressure in their mouth pulled on a diaphragm inside the regulator. This opened a valve, allowing compressed air from the tank to flow through, automatically adjusted to match the ambient water pressure at that depth. When the diver stopped inhaling, the diaphragm returned to its resting position, and the valve closed. No air was wasted, no constant hiss. Just breath, delivered on demand. They called it the Aqua-Lung. The first time Cousteau dove with the Aqua-Lung in 1943, he experienced something no heavy suit diver, no bell operator, no bathysphere occupant had ever felt. Freedom. No hose tugging at his head, no umbilical dragging across the bottom, no shot line to follow, no tender's topside managing his air supply, no lifeline limiting how far he could swim. Just tanks on his back, a regulator in his mouth, and the open water in every direction. He could swim horizontally, not walk, swim with fins on his feet, gliding through the water with a fluidity that would have been impossible in the heavy suit. He could ascend vertically, rising through the water column without climbing a ladder or being winched upward on a cable. He could descend, controlling his depth with breath and buoyancy, drifting down into the blue with nothing but his own judgment and the capacity of his tanks to limit him. It was, he would later write, like flying. The heavy suit diver was a laborer, grounded, slow, moving across the seafloor with lead-weighted boots, working with thick gloves tethered to the surface by necessity and by design. The job was industrial, salvage, construction, repair. The diver was a tool deployed to a work site, tasked with accomplishing something specific, then retrieved when the work was done. The Aqua-Lung diver was something else entirely, an observer, an explorer, unencumbered by lead weights or carrying only enough to achieve neutral buoyancy, free to move in 3 dimensions, able to hover motionless in mid-water or swim with the grace of a fish. The relationship to the underwater world shifted from conquest to immersion, from invasion to visitation. Cousteau described it in his book and film, both titled The Silent World. The title was apt. Without the constant hiss and thud of air pumps, without the mechanical roar of helmet ventilation, the underwater world revealed itself as profoundly, eerily quiet. The only sounds were your own breath, inhalation, the rush of air from the regulator, exhalation, the burble of bubbles rising toward the surface, and the distant muffled noises of the ocean itself, the click of shrimp, the low-frequency rumble of distant ship engines, the occasional creak of shifting rock or coral. It was silent, and in that silence, it was beautiful. Diving, after the Aqua-Lung ceased to be purely industrial. Oh, commercial diving continued. Hard hat divers still walked the bottom in heavy suits, still performed the dangerous necessary work of underwater construction and salvage. The heavy suit did not disappear. It remained the tool of choice for deep commercial work, for environments where tethered air supply and heavy ballast were not liabilities but necessities. But a new kind of diving emerged alongside it: recreational diving, scientific diving, exploration for its own sake. Divers descended not to recover cargo or repair hulls, but to observe, to film, to study marine life in its natural habitat, to experience, however briefly, what it felt like to exist in a realm that had been, for all of human history, completely inaccessible. Cousteau's films, The Silent World, World Without Sun, brought this experience to millions of people who would never dive themselves. They saw the gliding figures moving effortlessly through crystalline water, surrounded by schools of fish, drifting over coral reefs, exploring underwater caves with nothing but a tank, a regulator, and a sense of wonder. The ocean in those films was not a hostile environment to be conquered. It was a place of beauty, of mystery, of quiet, meditative immersion. The narrative had changed. Diving was no longer just survival. It was communion. Listen to a scuba diver breathe, and you hear the fundamental rhythm of the experience. Inhale. A deep mechanical hiss as the regulator opens, delivers pressurized air, fills your lungs. The sensation is strange at first. Breathing against resistance, the air dense and cool, your chest expanding against the slight pressure of the water. Exhale. A soft roar, a cascade of bubbles rising past your face, glittering as they ascend, each one expanding as the pressure decreases, wobbling and merging and finally bursting at the surface far above. Inhale. Exhale. Inhale. Exhale. It becomes a meditation, a metronome, the rhythm that governs your time underwater, that reminds you with every breath that you are alive, that the air is flowing, that the system is working. And between breaths, silence, or near silence, the muffled, distant sounds of the underwater world, filtered through water and the rubber of your hood. You are present but apart, visiting but not belonging, a temporary resident in a realm where breath itself is borrowed, carried in metal cylinders, rationed by pressure and time. The heavy suit taught humans to survive underwater. It was a brilliant, brutal piece of engineering that allowed men to work in conditions that should have killed them. It extended human capability, human reach, human industry into the depths. It was a tool of labor, of salvage, of construction. And it worked. But it never let you forget that you were an outsider. The weight, the restriction, the constant hiss of pumped air, the umbilical tugging at your head, all of it reminded you every second that you were a creature of the surface, temporarily and precariously invading a space where you did not belong. The Aqua-Lung changed that calculus. Not completely. You were still an outsider, still dependent on technology, still limited by the capacity of your tanks and the physiology of your body. You could not stay down forever. You could not go infinitely deep. You still had to return, eventually, to the air above. But for the duration of the dive, 20 minutes, 40 minutes, an hour if you were shallow and conservative, you could move as if you belonged. You could glide. You could hover. You could turn slow circles in mid-water, weightless and graceful, watching the play of light through the surface, the dance of fish around coral, the slow drift of particulate matter suspended in the column. You could, for a brief and luminous moment, feel what it might be like to be a creature of the sea. Cousteau's film, released in 1956, won the Palme d'Or at Cannes. It was one of the first documentaries to do so. Audiences who had never seen underwater footage, or had only seen the murky, brief glimpses from early helmet camera dives, were transfixed. The film showed divers moving through the water with an ease that seemed impossible. No heavy suits, no cables, just men in simple wetsuits and fins carrying tanks, breathing through regulators, swimming alongside sharks and rays and schools of fish that scattered and reformed like living clouds. It showed the ocean as a place of beauty, of color, the brilliant blues and greens of tropical water, the reds and yellows of coral, the silver flash of fish scales, of life everywhere, abundant, diverse, thriving in an ecosystem that most viewers had never imagined. And it showed silence, the absence of mechanical noise, the quiet that exists below the surface, where the chaos of the human world, engines, voices, wind, is filtered out, leaving only the essential sounds of water and breath. The film's title was perfect, The Silent World, a world that had always been there just beneath the surface, waiting, and now, for the first time, humans could visit it, not as conquerors or laborers, but as guests. If you trace the history of diving, you see an arc. It begins with desperation, with the need to recover cargo from wrecks, to repair ships, to work underwater because the economic necessity demands it. The technology that emerges is industrial, brutal. The diving bell, the heavy suit, tools designed to keep men alive long enough to do a job and return. Then comes curiosity, the desire to go deeper, to see what is there, to observe rather than work. The bathysphere, a vessel for witnesses, not laborers, still tethered, still dependent, but pushing the boundary of depth, of knowledge, of human experience. And finally, liberation, the Aqua-Lung, the untethered diver, the ability to move freely, to explore for its own sake, to experience the underwater world not as a hostile environment to be endured, but as a place of wonder to be savored, from survival to observation to belonging. Each stage required letting go of something. The bell let go of the surface, bringing air down. The heavy suit let go of the bell's confinement, allowing the diver to walk. The bathysphere let go of walking, embracing the deep. And the Aqua-Lung let go of the tether, freeing the diver to move as they wished. Each stage was a step closer to being at home in the water, not permanently, not without limits, but briefly, silently, lightly. Picture it, a diver suspended in clear blue water, no hose, no cable, no heavy boots anchoring them to the bottom, just a figure in mid-water, breathing slowly, fins moving with the gentlest strokes, surrounded by light filtering down from the surface. They are weightless, they are free, they are, for this moment, part of the ocean. They inhale, and the sound is a soft hiss. They exhale and bubbles stream upward, catching the light, dissolving into the blue above. And for this moment, in this silence, in this weightless suspension, they are as close as a human being can come to belonging in a world that was never meant for them. The weight of water, which once crushed and confined and threatened, now holds them gently, buoys them, lets them fly. The heavy suit taught humans to survive underwater. The Aqua-Lung taught them to belong. Briefly, silently, lightly, but to belong nonetheless.